What's up guys, it's me Jeremy. I do a lot of research about champion development, and when I say a lot, I mean a lot. If a champion designer at Riot so much as sneezes on a character, I'm probably going to find out about it. And with that research comes a lot of boring stuff that I filter out, but amongst all of the piles of threads that I read through, the messages that I send, and the topics that I investigate, I also encounter a few hidden gems that just blow my mind and are absolutely incredible. And although I might still make what could have been videos for these champions in the future, think of those as like an individual album and this as like a greatest hits compilation. Abbey Road was a masterpiece, but that doesn't mean I don't enjoy rocking out to the Beatles' greatest hits every once in a while. You get the idea. This is the best of the scrapped abilities that could have made it into League of Legends, but didn't for one reason or another. And I'm hyping this one up because I truly believe that these abilities are just something extra special, and so much more than what we've looked at in past compilation videos. So as always, if you guys enjoyed the video, hit that like button, and if you don't, hit that dislike, and let's get started. The first ability we have is one that existed in one of the original designs of the Urgot rework. For those who don't know, Urgot was planned to receive a rework this year, but it's been shelved and is currently no longer in development since the team that worked on him was unable to capture a meaningful gameplay design that kept his theme intact. All of the successful designs just made Urgot a completely different champion, and his rework is probably expected for 2017 or maybe even later now. One of the abilities that was used during the different potential versions of the Urgot rework was this Jace Gate type of ability. However, instead of speeding up allies that passed through it, what it did instead was that it multiplied allied projectiles that were shot through it. So for example, if you shot an Ashe ultimate through this Urgot Gate ability, you would get 3 Ashe ultimates coming out of it in a volley-like formation. It turned every skill shot from you and your allies that passed through it into 3 different ones. And this is one of the few cases where, yeah, the ability was as crazy as it sounds, especially since it was not his ultimate. The designer who worked on the ability described it as just being totally absurd. It was cool as hell and would have been so much fun to play with, but it was also completely broken, impossible to balance, and to top it off, it was impossible to code too. This ability pretty much broke the entire game, and although it was fun as hell, it was just impossible to make work with the engines. The Riot designers love to try out crazy ideas on the off chance that they just might be super fun, and although this Urgot Gate was fun as heck and was totally insane, it just had too many things stacked against it. Our next ability comes from our man Riot Gypsy Lord, a lead champion designer at Riot Games. When I was talking to him about some information revolving around Gnar, he shared an unrelated ability with Echo that actually just blew my mind. During his development for quite a long while, Echo's original W was actually his Chrono Break. It was his ultimate. It functioned almost exactly to the way his current ultimate does now, which I'm sure you can imagine, but instead, it was on a cooldown that would be typical of an ability on a champion's W, so the cooldown it had was probably about 20 seconds or so. And Gypsy Lord described this ability as probably the most broken and overpowered version of any champion that he had ever worked on, literally ever. So yeah, this thing was pretty dang insane. It's interesting that they tried out his kit like that, but honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if we see like a discount Echo ultimate in the future, maybe akin to this ability. Next up, we're taking a look at an ability that I actually missed during my Azir video. During Azir's original design, he was being developed as more of a traditional mage-type champion, revolving around the use of sand rather than being a mage-emperor hybrid kind of guy. And in that original design of him where he was being made under the name Seth, before he would get cancelled and then go on to be revisited into Azir, his kit involved the use of this mechanic around sand. One of the abilities he had involved spreading sand around the map and interacting with it, almost like how the Zerg from StarCraft interact with creep. You could use that ability to spread sand around the map, and while you were in the sand you were probably given buffs and maybe bonus movement speed, as well as other interactions with his abilities. It was an interesting concept to design the entire kit of a champion around, and it was pretty cool, but unfortunately it wasn't actually that fun to play with, since it made it so that whenever you were in an area that you didn't have your sand spread to, it was really lackluster and quite frustrating. Another ability that was really just crazy, and actually is one that had a lot more potential than some of the others on this list, took place in Caitlyn. Now Caitlyn is a really old champion, so it's difficult to uncover information from her design, but originally Caitlyn had an ability on her W but instead of placing a cupcake trap on the ground, it would literally place an actual bush at the ground on a targeted location. She could go around the map placing bushes all over the place and could use them to juke out opponents during fights or just as a way to interact with her kit, which heavily revolved around bushes. This ability was pretty cool, and that version of Caitlyn was interesting and actually had a lot of potential. However, unfortunately at the time when they were designing Caitlyn, they didn't have the technology to get an ability like this to work. Remember, this isn't the reworked Caitlyn. We're talking about the original Caitlyn that was designed in 2010. And because of that, it was removed and they decided to go with an ability that was much simpler, while also keeping the bush theme kind of within her kit by giving her the headshot passive that interacts with bushes a little bit. But this ability definitely had a lot of potential, and it's actually possible that it may even exist in the future, now that the design tech has evolved a ton for champions over the past few years. The next ability we're taking a look at involves a little short story about an interesting development cycle that could have occurred. The Juggernaut update back in Season 5 was a pretty big deal because it was the first instance of Riot doing this massive rework to a bunch of champions. However, what you might not know is that Udyr was originally planned to be part of the Juggernaut rework. Udyr was going to get a rework on the scale of, Garen and Darius and the others, and he definitely falls into the category of being a Juggernaut, so I could see why that would happen, but it was eventually decided that he didn't need a rework. And they probably had tested a few other champions too for being reworked as well, that the team eventually decided against. And during that phase of the team attempting to construct a rework for Udyr, one of the abilities that he had would allow him to spawn additional neutral monsters on the map. They really took the idea of him being a farm-heavy jungler and just pushed it to the max by giving Udyr the ability to spawn what were essentially just additional jungle camps for him to farm from. And they weren't just any odd normal jungle camps, they were like crazy-ass monsters on steroids that did some crazy things during combat, but also upon the kill too that made for a meaningful reason for opponents to contest them, rather than Udyr just getting a bunch of free extra monster kills and XP. The idea was pretty crazy, and it was interesting, but it ended up not making the cut, as they decided that Udyr just didn't need a rework. Another ability that could have existed in League of Legends involves something from Shaco, or actually rework Shaco. Now, as for the progress of the Shaco rework, I'm not entirely sure, and it's probably not coming anytime soon, if at all, as there's much more pressing champions that Riot wants to rework like Yorick and Ryze. But when the design team was messing around with the idea of a Shaco rework, they tested out a couple of abilities. One of the more notable ones that could have existed in this Shaco rework turned Shaco himself into a projectile and launched him in a direction, and at the end of the projectile, he split into two Shacos at the end of it. This was an interesting way to take the current function of his ultimate that he has now and maybe make it a little bit more exciting or a little bit more impactful upon the actual activation. But the problems the ability had with the coding were actually unsurmountable, so much so that if Shaco used this ability, launched himself out, and then hit a wind wall from Yasuo, he would disappear from the game completely and forever. For the entirety of the rest of that game, Shaco would cease to exist, and the person playing Shaco would be powerless, as his team would have to play out a 4v5 for the rest of the game due to the bug. So, as I'm sure you can imagine, that ability just had to be scrapped, as making a champion literally disappear from the game forever wasn't exactly the most ideal thing to occur during a game of League of Legends, although it's not impossible that a similar ability, or at least a similar concept of trying to make Shaco's ultimate more impactful upon the initial cast, exists in the future, if he actually is going to get a rework in the next couple of years. The next ability involves something that was the original design plan for Tahm Kench. In his very first gameplay kit, Tahm Kench had a passive that would cause enemy champions who stood near him to gradually have the vision range lowered over time, until it reached its full peak. At that point, it would also hide your allies from your vision, on top of giving you what was the vision radius of something like how Quinn's Blind is now. And this was on this passive that took only a few seconds to activate, at which point the opponent was left just stuck not being able to see well enough to get out of it. And you guys thought the current version of Tahm Kench was annoying. Eventually this passive proved to be broken beyond belief, and they knew that not only was it super overpowered, it was frustrating and unfair to play against. So the vision reduction mechanic was toned down a bit and moved to the Devour portion of his W instead. And the next ability we have involved something that was planned to be on Soraka during one of her reworks. I think this ability was the original version of her Q for her rework, although it might have been her W or something, but I'm going to assume that it was Honor Cube because that's definitely the most likely candidate. Anyway, this ability, instead of being an offensive damaging skill shot, it was an area of effect, Mikhail's Crucible for her allies. So it would throw down a zone, and then any allies that were in it were given a nice little heal, and were also cleansed of all crowd control and debuffs. It functioned pretty much exactly how you could expect Mikhail's Crucible to, except it was in an area of effect radius and on a much shorter cooldown. With some cooldown reduction, it was likely that you could be using this ability multiple times in fights. Now, cleanse effects are something League of Legends haven't really explored all that well. I believe the designers much prefer Spell Shield as a mechanic over Cleanse to avoid some ability, but there's no doubt that this Soraka ability would be pretty insane, and it would honestly just hard counter such a large amount of champions in the game to where she would just become a ridiculous champion herself. Cleanse is a really weird mechanic in League, because versus a lot of champions, it's a total hard counter, while versus others, it's honestly kind of useless, and that situationalness of an ability is something Riot really likes items to have, or maybe summoner spells, but it's very difficult to put on an actual champion. As the designers say, they want every champion to be good in their own way, on their own right. No champion should be good for the sole reason that it counters someone else. Because then that champion's success entirely revolves around the thing that it counters, and they don't want to limit it to where it feels super lame to play a champion just because you aren't playing against, that one specific counter matchup. And as a result of that design philosophy, this ability was removed from Soraka, although it was a pretty cool concept for sure. And that just about wraps up this list of what I think were some of the coolest abilities that could have made it into League of Legends, but didn't for whatever reason. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, subscribe if you want. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.
耳をすませば